I think that the density management program, the studies, it's really been a wonderful thing to see, especially how the Forest Service on the young stand diversity study and especially the BLM with the density management study actually took a hold of this and really ran with it. I think from my perspective, we laid out with the BLM, we laid out some plans, some approaches, and the implementation and really the incentive to get them done came entirely within the agencies. And I especially like to mention Charlie Thompson. Charlie, stand up and wave your hand, would you? Because Charlie was really a big player in getting this program started, and he of course had lots of help from people at the resource area level. But all the prescriptions, all the work that was done on these studies was done by field-going foresters for the BLM. I mean, we had very little involvement with researchers going out and marking trees or telling people what to do. They just took the prescriptions and applied them. Not only got them on the ground, but got them logged, sold the logs, did the whole program. So the kind of management that we're talking about here is perfectly possible, and I think that's just from the agency's standpoint. It's not at all, I say impossible to do, or that, I won't say difficult, because I know there's a lot of sweat and tears that went into putting these things out. But nevertheless, it was accomplished by guys out there like you just doing the work. So I really think you all owe yourself a hand of applause or some gratitude on that, from that standpoint. So this presentation, I hope it'll generate some discussion. It's not the ideal place to have discussion, but maybe afterwards or during the questions there can be some talk about what I present. So what I'd really like to do is to present some things to talk about. And this isn't a very, what I'd say, a very beautiful slide to get this whole thing going. But what the point is here, that trees have patterns of height growth, and this is a pattern of height growth for Douglas fir. It's the age down below, and it's the percent of total height growth at these different ages. And I think the main point here is that from after about age 70 or 80, the height growth begins to slow down. So you can really do a tremendous amount to shape the trees in the stand by early thinning. So it's a good idea to have some density management, density control at early ages, so you have an opportunity to get trees with big crowns, with some stability in the stems, and to begin to build the stand. So, and I think that density can actually start at the time of planting. I think a lot of cases we've planted so many trees per acre, and they got some natural regeneration that comes in with them, and then we say, oh my gosh, what am I going to do with all these trees? Now I understand that, because early on, when we were just trying to get stands established, we were happy to see all those trees out there. But now we have to live with them. So I think our success was really a lot better than we expected with the regeneration, and now we've got quite dense stands. So maybe one of the first things we could do would be to back off of our planting densities. One of the things we could do would be do commercial thinning for sure, and I understand that's difficult now with the funding the way it is. And that's not to say that you can't accomplish a lot in stands that are 50 years old or 60 years old, because they still do have quite a bit of height growth left to them. But think about density at early ages. Oh gosh, maybe we could put this in the in the handout. This is, it doesn't show up as well as I hoped it would. But what we have here is a black line that represents an unthinned stand. And then the other lines represent stands that are thinned, and then there's lots of information on the side, which I'm afraid you're going to have to wait till you get the proceedings on this to read it. But the point is that by early thinning, if you think about individual tree growth, you get larger, surely you get larger diameters, and you get a higher proportion of trees with larger diameters with early heavy thinning. Also, you get larger crowns. Trees maintain their crowns as the trees grow up around them. Stand isn't so dense, and so you get trees with larger crowns and larger limbs as you thin the stands, and especially thinning them early. When you thin them later, you're more in the mode of maintaining crown length, not necessarily growing new crowns. You sort of maintain the crowns that are below, and then of course some additional crowns are added as the trees go higher. And the other thing that happens in early thinning, in thinning young stands, is that you produce trees with big stems and low height to diameter ratios. And that is, you produce trees that are quite stable against wind and ice and snow. And a lot of the young stands, like that one where there was no thinning, the height diameter ratios in those stands are very, very high, like in the neighborhood of 70 or so. And that means that if you measure the tree in diameter in feet and divide it into its height, you get a ratio of 70, okay? Which indicates a fairly unstable tree. If you measure the height diameter ratios in old growth stands, the height diameter ratios are down around 40 or 50, quite low. So the tree is big in diameter in relation to its height. And that's what you'd like if you want trees that are going to stand up to wind and snow and actually live to be fairly old. And I think that's important whether you're on 80 or 90-year rotation or something like that, or if you're really trying to grow old growth trees that go out to a couple hundred years, okay? So I think that's, we often think about live crowns and large live crowns in structure, and of course tree size is something that everybody likes to see in old forest, but also along with that is this stability issue of the height to diameter ratio. So I would say let's use some of that as a guide. Let's use some of those numbers or those ideas as guides for growing trees, particularly if you want them to last for a long time. Well, another principle I think that's important to keep in mind is that when we thin stands, we're managing the understory as well as the overstory. You can't avoid it really, and it's different depending on the kind of forest you're in. And this is an example of some thinning in BLM stands. And this was a normal thinning to produce wood, and I think in some cases they're producing seed trees in here too. And you see there's a few hemlock that got started in this stand, natural regeneration of hemlock, okay? Now in some places, as you know, out on the coast, that could be a sea of hemlock. They would just come in and you'd have all kinds of hemlock all over the place. Other places, all you'd get is a salal. And then there's other places where you can get just about anything in between. Once the salal and say vine maple or salmonberry or some of the other shrubs come in, it's very difficult to get an understory of trees started, at least naturally. And there you really have to do some management, some regular regeneration management, the kind of things that Mike's going to talk about later on. So there's a lot I think especially if you're just worried about the trees, I think the principles are fairly simple. If you're worried about starting new stands, starting understories, then it becomes more difficult. And you really have to think that through, because it's difficult to plant and get trees started in a dense cover of salal like this. It really is. You're going to have to use all the regeneration tools that you've learned in clear cutting. They all apply, and you need to use those. You need to plant. Other places you get too much hemlock, and then we have to be in the business of thinning out the understory to produce those trees. I'm speaking really west side here. So think about when you begin to thin, and if you're really going for diverse stands, you need to think overstory, understory. You can't leave out the understory. And here's an example of that. This is also an example of very heavy thinning, and it produced a lot of hazel in the understory here, which is probably a good thing in terms of songbirds, and it produces some mast and so forth. So that's fine, but no trees. And so you have to, if you want an understory of hardwoods or say hemlock, then some veg management would be needed here. And the question is then how do you do it? How much do you do? How much of an understory do you really want? And those are questions I don't think we've really dealt with yet. We just don't know the answers to those. So that's something down the road is a lot more on understory management. So here's an example. This is out at Black Rock, and many of you have seen this. This is a stand that was started after logging, really the old style logging, lots of ground skidding, old growth trees cut, and a wonderful stand of young Douglas fir came back. It's produced a lot of volume, but there it is. And I think that's where a lot of our plantations are headed if we don't do any density management, okay? And I'm not at all saying there's a thing wrong with this stand. It's produced a tremendous amount of volume. The trees aren't very big. There's quite a bit of self-thinning that's gone on. About 30% of the volume that's been produced is on the ground, which is okay. But these aren't very big trees, either from a commercial standpoint or for wood on the forest floor, or from snags or downwood from a habitat standpoint. So lots of volume production, a little bit of an understory. I'd really like to own this stand myself, to tell you the truth. It's a wonderful stand, but it's not, I don't think it's producing what we really want in terms of contemporary management. So what are our goals? Is this the kind of stand we want to produce in the future? This is an old growth stand down on Dead Indian Plateau. And you can see that those trees, those great big trees, came in at fairly low densities. You can see there's these large crowns. You can see that there's large branches. And what has happened here previously, about 20 or 30 years previously, the BLM took out dead trees from this stand. They salvaged and they took out some white fir and so forth that were not very healthy. And now another understory, mostly of Douglas fir, is coming back in. And this is kind of an aside, but these trees are they're well over 200 years old, most of them. And we went back and measured the growth rates of these trees about 30 years after the BLM had taken out the understory. I mean, they did it skillfully. There was no damage to the overstory. These trees all responded. They grew faster as individual trees than they did. And so I'm not, based on that, and we saw this on lots of stands down in Southern Oregon, that based on this, I'm not at all worried about logging among these great big trees if it's done carefully, because their growth rates, their basal area growth rates, in some cases went up by 20 or 30%. You don't see that in the small rings. You see a little bit of a jump in the rings, but not much. You turn that into basal area across these big stems, and it's quite a bit of additional wood is being laid on those trees. So it's not the idea so much that these trees produce more wood, but they're just like anyone else, I guess, or any tree else. They're affected by competition. And so you can take out trees, whether it's from fire, whether it's for fire protection, or you want to manage a stand and keep these big trees in it. I think it's perfectly possible. In fact, there's lots of examples that that's been done. Maybe not for the same purposes, but we can go back and see how it worked out. So don't overlook these big guys. They're pretty vigorous. So you can look at this stand and compare it with this one. Here's a case where that previous stand could have been thinned and planted with an understory of hemlock. This is what was done. This is an example from Black Rock. And these trees were thinned to 50, the stand was thinned to 50 tree breaker. I'm sure quite a few of you have seen this, and then underplanted. So it's entirely possible to get an understory started and grow trees at the same, overstory trees at the same time. 50 trees per acre, believe it or not, is too many trees if you really want to grow an understory. At least in this case, they shaded out and killed they didn't kill, but they kept the hemlock from producing the kind of understory we might like, any size of any big hemlock. Okay. I think that in terms of managing stands for old forest characteristics, including snags and dead wood, you make a choice to grow big trees. You produce big downwood, you produce big snags. From a commercial standpoint, if you thin, you could harvest trees that die like this too. So there's some advantages to thinning. These were trees that were killed by root disease, phalinus, and I think in terms of old forest, there's a lot we can't do, or we can let the natural process in the stands do for us, and that's produce this down wood. You know, we produce big trees, we thin, we get big trees, and then we do have some blowdown or root disease and that sort of thing, and then that will let these bigger trees become the snags and some of the structure or down wood and some of the structure that we want in these stands. The density management isn't going to prevent the disease, but it's going to produce bigger trees when the disease occurs. Okay. These are just some of the guidelines that were implemented when we put in the density management study. And that is that we cut the majority of species. In other words, if most of the stands, and they were mostly Douglas fir, those are the ones that were thin. We generally saved the minor species. In some cases, the minor species might have been red cedar, might have been hemlock, might have been hardwoods, but we tried to keep those in the stand. Any big trees in the stand that were left from the previous harvesting, the previous cutting, those were left in the stand. That was just a decision that was made that we did study-wide. So on all the 10 sites or so, these things were carried out, and simply the people that did the marking, the crews that did the marking, just simply followed these guidelines. This isn't a conventional thinning in the sense that what you learn about in textbooks or probably learned about in your silviculture classes, but this is what we did in these studies, and as far as I can see, it's fine. You know, it worked out quite well. These are goals that we had for snags in the density management study. They were easily met. We simply varied the marking criteria to include snags like this, and we left trees that were, you know, fork-topped or diseased or somehow weren't the most vigorous trees in the stand. They might be the good wildlife trees or the good snags of the future. So these were just some simple things that were implemented as we put in this study. thinning can be quite flexible. You can, I don't think it's important. I think density reduction overall, especially if you're not talking about plots here, but we're talking about in this study 50-acre stands. So it's realistic. You can do a lot of things at a bigger scale, like 50 acres that you can't do on small plots, acre-wise plots, or those sorts of things. So for implementing these density management treatments for habitat, for structure and so forth, I think you have to think big. You can't do it on small acreages. You have to do it over fairly large, sort of stand level acres. In this case, about 50 acres or so in this study. So you can spacing can vary to favor minor species. You can either take out or release wildlife trees, understory trees, reduce flammability and fire potential in parts of the stand or whatever. You can, varying your thinning at this scale there's no problem with that. You can thin from above or below. You can do all kinds of things in which trees you take out and which trees you leave. If thinning from above has two potentials, I think. For one thing, it can be used to make snags. That's essentially thinning from above. It can also be used to produce some revenue. You could take some poles out of the stand or some valuable trees to help pay for the cost of doing the thinning and the treatments you might want to do in other stands or in the rest of the stand. So I think there's some opportunities there. We generally don't look at thinning that way, but in times of low funding for projects, maybe we could, especially when if the markets go back up for high value trees like that. I think as a rule, we call for a thinning to say 18 feet or whatnot. I think you can easily vary thinning by 50% of that to leave better trees or desirable trees, and you're not going to change the outcome of your experience of your thinning very much at all, except you leave the kinds of trees you want to leave, whether it's the larger ones, the better growing ones, a certain species you want to leave. You do need really well-trained crews and to do all of this. You need good timber markers. You want people who can think on their feet and see opportunities in the stand and take advantage of them. And that's what the folks in the BLM and the Forest Service did when they put these studies in. They did a good job. Obviously, the timber fallers, skidder operators, etc., all are part of the package. So you need all of those things. And there's other things that we did in this study. Whether you want to do them or not, I think we did them because we just wanted to see how they fit into the program, how they fit into a thinning prescription. Could they be done? What difficulties do they present? I don't think in the study we had particular goals in mind for these, except the idea would be, well, if you had some rare plants in a stand, then maybe you need to leave that part of the stand uncut, and it gave us an opportunity to measure microclimates and so forth. You could seed, put grass in, natural grasses in on skid roads. You could do some underburning. You might want to control exotics, although the work we've done here, at least in the past thinnings, the exotics weren't a big issue in these natural stands. One of the things the wildlife biologists wanted to do in this study was to make openings so that they could see if especially elk and deer would use them. So we did that. And finally, this is some work that Nathan Pogue, who worked with me, did. And this is, it could be diameter growth or basal area growth of trees at 50 years old. And then he measured old trees that were 200 years old or more, and he looked at their diameter or basal area growth rate when they were 50 years old, and then he looked at the size of the trees when they were 200 years old or more. And so this is the size at 200 years. This is centimeters along the vertical axis, and the size of the trees at 200 years old was really highly correlated with how rapidly they were growing when they were 50 years old. So that says, okay, if you want big trees, let's get with it. Let's get them growing early, and according to this, to his work, and then we've repeated this, the same kind of work down in Southern Oregon, Tom Sense, I think, did, and he found the same thing. So it seems to be, at least on our study sites, which are quite a few of them actually, about 30 or more, that this is what we found. So I think there is a lot to be said about early thinning and heavy thinning to at least get some of the bigger trees growing. That doesn't mean you do it on every stand everywhere, but certainly in areas where you really want to grow some big trees, this seems to be the thing to do. Okay.
Question for John?
Hi, John. I'm Dee Dee Olson. So when you first designed the density management study and you were looking at your crystal ball back in 1993 and 94, the Northwest Forest Plan was being conceived at that time. And you looked across the west side landscape and saw young managed stands coming. And so your crystal ball said, okay, we need to learn more about thinning. And what I've just heard today is that there's quite a complex toolbox of thinning methods that you can apply. So now if I could fast forward you to today or 10 years from today, and let's look at the west side landscape. What are some of the key questions that you see going forward and that we need to really maybe refocus our lens to move forward in a context of both commodity production and conservation? How can we apply these tools across a landscape to meet both types of objectives?
Okay. Simple question. Well, in the best of all worlds, you would be able to do pre-commercial thinning and work in some really young stands. You would get control of the planting and plant at lower densities. I think you develop a group of people in the agencies who really knew how to thin, who really liked doing that work, and that was their work. I think that's what made reforestation successful early on, was that you had a lot of workshops, you trained a lot of people who really wanted to go out and get those trees growing when they clear cut. And I think the agencies sort of need the flexibility to be able to move things around and work on things in site specifically, frankly, with not a whole lot of people looking over their shoulder. I mean, I think my impression is that the agencies know how to do this work. They just need to be allowed to go ahead and do it. I think a lot of the questions are the same, and the principles are the same. I just don't think that they've really had the agencies have had the ability to go ahead and apply them to apply the principles as well as they do. So I would sort of err on the side, if err is the right word, of turning the agencies loose and letting them do that and then seeing how they do, rather than just sort of holding them back and have everything just perfect before they're allowed to go ahead and do some thinnings. I don't think thinning isn't, it often doesn't, it doesn't destroy stands. I mean, stands, Mike will tell you, he had a stand on his property where I'm going to tell your story, Mike, and you correct me. And I've gone out and looked at it. And the problem was, his conundrum was, this stand had been high graded. They had taken out all the big trees for wood. And the question was, should I cut all the rest of the trees down and start a new stand? Because it just looked awful. I'm using your words, I think. And you go back and look at that stand now, and it looks anything but awful. Those trees are about 50 years old, I think. And they responded and they produced the most beautiful stand you could possibly imagine. Great big trees, good crowns, lots of habitat possibilities and lots of wood possibilities too. So this isn't by way of saying, well, it doesn't matter what you do when the stand is young, but only that trees have a lot of capability to, to respond, okay? So I wouldn't worry too much about damaging stands, especially if you take a longer term view, and I don't think damaging stands is what's going to happen anyway. I think the other thing is that we have the 80-year rule from the Northwest Forest Plan, and that puts foresters, silviculturists in a tight box because, so what are you going to do? If you have a 50-year-old stand and you've got lots of other stands out there to work on, you sort of have one opportunity, maybe your 50, 60, 70-year-old stands, and then you'd maybe like to thin that stand a couple, 3 times, but once it stepped across that 80-year threshold, unless I guess you do some really jumping through hoops and so forth, you're stuck, you can't do any more. And then it precludes the notion of growing some beautiful stands at older ages, like some of the black rock stands that maybe most of you have seen. And we know that these old trees will respond to thinning. So I think the idea of loosening up on that and trying to have longer rotations would give you much more options in the long run of where you're going to do some wood production or where you're going to grow some habitat for old growth like species. Off the top of my head, that's the best I can do. Anything else you want to follow up on that?
Okay. Thank you.
One more question, if we have time.
Yeah, my name is Doug Heiken with Oregon Wild, and I'm a big fan of thinning, but I also want to recognize that there's a value in not thinning some places. And you showed the picture of the no-thin stand at Black Rock and said that doesn't really meet our objectives right now. And I want to challenge that thought. Looking at that stand, it had a lot of dead wood on the ground, it had a lot of density-dependent mortality occurring, it was a high-density stand that some wildlife species like. Wouldn't that be at least part of our objective? In a landscape of thin stands, wouldn't we want to see some places like that? And I guess my question is, how do we find the right mix of the treated areas and the untreated areas so we get the benefits from both of those approaches?
Well, thanks. Yeah, right. If those kinds of stands are needed for habitat, surely. I don't know that you would want to start out with that density necessarily. I mean, I think you could have the same kind of habitat, maybe with a fewer more trees, and the dead wood would be bigger and that kind of thing. But I wouldn't quibble with you at all about maybe to have some of those stands on the landscape. I can't answer the question really about what sort of mix you need, how many of this or that. I'd say that Joan Hager and some of the people who look at wildlife species who'll be on your program later, they would probably give you a better answer to that. I know one difficulty with these density management studies is they don't really address species populations, at least for birds, and I don't know about the amphibians, but they don't really address the populations at a landscape basis. We know certain species tend to use these stands. How they fare throughout the landscape, I'm not the one to ask that question, I'm sorry. But I do agree with your earlier statement about, okay, let's have some of those stands in the landscape. Okay?